Hey. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Stephen Urgola, University Archivist at the American University in Cairo in Egypt. Oh. Anyway, so today I'll talk about how diversity and cross-cultural ties have been central to AUC since its earliest days, and how this has been reflected in the past and present archival work of its rare books and special collections library and its university archives. Sure. Thank you. So this slide shows an image that I think encapsulates the university's mission of connecting people from diverse backgrounds. This drawing of clasped hands connecting American skyscrapers with Egyptian pyramids was not widely used at the university, but the phrase "a bridge of friendliness" was employed fairly often in AUC promotional material in its early years. First, a little background. When AUC was founded in 1919, the American University in Cairo was located downtown in what's now Tahrir Square. And it stayed there until most of its operations moved to a new suburban campus in 2009. So that's where I'm based right now. Founder Charles Watson was inspired by his Protestant Christian missionary background to bring American-style higher education to Egypt, which only had two universities at the time of its founding in 1919. AUC now has over 6,000 undergraduate students, but it started out very small, and yearly enrollment never really topped over 400 throughout the 1920s and 30s. Despite that, AUC brought educational innovations to Egypt in its early years, introducing hands-on science lab work and student athletics like the gymnastics pyramid shown here. Now, at AUC, inclusion and diversity among the student body came quite early. Its first woman student was admitted in 1928, and that's almost half a century before many US universities, including the university that I attended, welcomed women students. As women became integrated into the university, for many years, a major event on campus was the Miss AUC competition. And this was not a beauty contest. This was an all-around award. As you can see by this news clipping, it shows Egyptian feminist leader Dorea Shafik, in 1955, donating a prize to that year's Miss AUC award winner. In terms of inclusion, for many years, there was also a Mr. AUC contest. So that was also present. Now, ultimately, by the late 1970s, the Miss AUC competition was discontinued as it faced criticisms about its relevance. Today, almost 60% of AUC students are women, and groups like the Heya Feminist Initiative are very active on campus. From its beginning, the university also emphasized the ethnic and religious diversity of its students. For much of its history, AUC was a refuge for those who fit uncomfortably into Egyptian society due to their ethnic or religious background, like many Armenian, Greek, and Jewish students who attended AUC through the 1960s, before the decline in those communities due to the policies of Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's president, in the 50s and 60s. Since the 1970s, International Day has been an annual event showcasing the national dishes and dress of various nationalities in the AUC student body. And today there's almost 70 nationalities represented at this. This function is a bridge for connecting cultures, brought into AUC's university archives rich documentation about Egypt's minority and foreign communities. For example, records on Palestinian students attending AUC. These trace the situation of that community in Egypt over the last century and even through the present day. So most recently in the last semester and the spring semester past year, we were collecting protest documentation of the students. Now, some of this documentation in the archives ranges from administrative responses to refugee students to the posters and publications of Palestinian-oriented student clubs and activities. The university archives also demonstrates how the university's administration, faculty, and staff evolved with society. At AUC, this took the form of a shift from a Christian-oriented institution to a secular one with an expanded role for Muslim faculty. After the 1960s, along with an increasingly prominent role for women in leadership from the 1970s on. AUC's place in Egypt as a cross-cultural institution played a key role in its hosting special collections. In the 1950s, AUC acquired the library and photograph collection of Islamic art and architecture scholar Sir K.A.C. Creswell, shown here. As a knighted British citizen, he would have been forced to leave Nasser's Egypt had he not made this arrangement with AUC and joined its faculty. As someone who might be classified as an Orientalist, Creswell was not exactly a paragon of DEI. While he trusted the running of his library for many years to Crystal Kessler, a woman who was a noted scholar in her own right, Creswell himself was known to treat Egyptians with scorn. I bring up Creswell as a surprising point of origin for collection building that eventually came to value diversity. In the 1990s, AUC's Rare Books and Special Collections Library emerged as a successor to the Creswell Library. A look at one collecting area today demonstrates strides taken since Creswell's time. Over the last decade, the library's Egyptology curator, Amr Kamel, has worked to acquire archival collections of Egyptian Egyptologists. Creswell's library and other book collections at RBSCL contain many works by Europeans who describe the country's history, but this new collecting effort sought to document how Egyptians studied their own ancient past. The personal papers of leading archaeologist Gabala Ali-Gabala is one of several collections that contain the records of excavations and field studies led by Egyptians from the mid-20th century onward. This initiative connects with efforts around the world to decolonize archival collections, coming full circle from the days of Sir Creswell. Building archival collections at RBSCL has been closely tied to AUC's embrace of students from minority groups in Egypt. A prime example is the collection of photographer Van Leo. Leon Boyajian belonged to Cairo's Armenian community, and after leaving AUC in the 1940s, he took the name Van Leo, and for over 30 years, he was the leading studio photographer in the country. His work included portraits of famous actors, singers, dancers, and other celebrities. I'm not sure if anyone recognizes the gentleman in the far photograph. That's Omar Sharif. So Van Leo took the first portrait of Omar Sharif. Beyond his celebrity subjects, Van Leo was admired for his creative compositions, lighting, and printing techniques. And you can see these in many self-portraits that he produced. That's on the left and then the far top right. In 1998, Van Leo looked to AUC when he donated to RBSCL his life's work, and that's over 25,000 prints and negatives, as well as his personal papers with material on Cairo's Armenian community. Beyond his personal connection with AUC as an alum, he wanted his archives to go to a repository in Egypt that would ensure his collection would be safeguarded and get the attention it deserved. As a private institution, AUC offered that, because Van Leo's collection contained potentially controversial material that could be suppressed elsewhere, like the gender-bending portrait here, or the personal documents that revealed the challenges of living in Egypt as part of a minority group. Building archival collections about women's experiences in Egypt has long been a focus at RBSCL. Social and alumni connections and AUC's history of offering a platform for discussion of women's roles in society were key here. In the 1980s, a former library director's family connections led to receiving the papers of pioneering feminist leader Khodeh Sharawi, who had given speeches on women's rights at AUC in the 1930s and 40s. Doreya Shafiq, as mentioned earlier, took the helm of the women's movement in Egypt by the 1950s. And in 1951, she led a march of 1,500 women from a conference at AUC to the nearby Egyptian parliament to demand women's participation in the political system. Her daughters, who were both AUC alumni and faculty members, donated her papers to RBSCL. Alumni ties also led Aziza Hussein of AUC's class of 1942 to donate her own papers, which documented her work with national and international women's groups, family planning organizations, and the famous 1994 United Nations Population Conference in Cairo. A common factor in these donations was AUC as a place where women's history material would be preserved and made accessible. AUC's programs in gender and women's studies and Arab history make these collections a natural fit. And the library works with faculty to integrate these collections into their courses. These women's history archives also forge a connection with international researchers, bridging scholars from around the world with Egypt. For example, just last month, a faculty member from Oxford University brought a group of students to AUC to engage with the collections. And these collections will be a focus of an international conference at AUC next spring. The conference will also be held at the Women in Memory Forum in Cairo, which RBSCL has collaborated with in highlighting the archival voices of Egyptian women. A few years ago, I co-authored a paper with its former associate Maysan Hassan, who will be presenting here later today. As a university that has former Egyptian First Lady Suzanne Mubarak and many past and present governmental leaders as alumni, it's natural that RBSCL holds archival collections of the political elite, like some papers of diplomat Boutros Ghali. But reflecting alternative political and social currents in Egyptian society has also been a goal for the library. It's pursued this by acquiring the records of non-governmental organizations like that of the late dissident Saadettin Ibrahim, collections about refugee communities in Egypt, and the archival traces of protest. For the last category, the main effort was the University on the Square documenting Egypt's 21st century revolution project, which collected signs, leaflets, photographs, videos, and artifacts from the 2011 through 2014 anti-governmental protests at Cairo's Tahrir Square and beyond. As a private binational university, AUC was uniquely positioned in Egypt to build and host these kind of collections. For example, some collections held by government institutions were suppressed. The other major aspect of the University on the Square project was the use of oral history to document the revolutionary events in Egypt. Capturing the voices of participants in the protests filled in where other records were lacking. Key to that effort was building inclusiveness into the initiative. From an initial pool of interviewees drawn from AUC faculty and staff and students, interviews were expanded to include a wider range of demonstrators, from medical volunteers to street fighting football ultras, to a barber who witnessed it all from his shop near Tahrir Square. Being representative in terms of sex and age, and to some extent nationality, were other goals. While it wasn't possible to capture all political orientations, some interviews did express reservations about the change coming to Egypt. From the start, the aim was to allow interviewees to express themselves as they wished, so interviews were conducted in Arabic or English. And so employing an interviewing team of students diverse in language ability and nationality was essential to the project, which produced over 400 interviews. Beyond politics, oral history has been an important tool for giving voice to alternative narratives and diverse communities in Egypt and at AUC. Interviews with participants in a major AUC student staff program a decade ago were made to balance official university disciplinary records. Recording a range of Egyptians' voices has reflected the country's diversity and offered balance to an archival record that often skewed toward elites. Conducting and collecting oral histories with members of Egypt's various ethnic communities, like Armenian, Greek, and Jewish Egyptians, has been one direction here. To reflect the lives of people from less privileged segments of society, several years ago, the library sent a team of students and staff, collaborating with local leaders, to interview older residents of a village district across the Nile from Luxor in southern Egypt. The 75 oral histories gathered testimonies on topics like family life, religious practice, festivals, work interactions with tourists and archaeologists, and the villagers' forced relocation from their homes to new housing. As these kinds of experiences don't necessarily generate written records for rural populations, oral history was a way to document the villagers' lifeways. This allows their testimonies to be presented side by side with those of architects, artists, activists, scholars, and others represented in RBSCL's Oral History Archive. The library's approach to its collections reflects the diversity of the material and of our users. With multilingual holdings, we have begun to apply description in multiple languages For example, labeling folders in Sharawi's collection in the original language of the items being housed, which ranged from Arabic to French to English to Ottoman Turkish, alongside transliteration from Arabic, and English translations were appropriate. For oral histories, we've been working to provide summaries in English and Arabic in our digital library, especially where full transcripts are not available. We have a ways to go, especially in rendering more English language description into Arabic. For example, we've started that with Creswell's collection. But the English summaries and for some oral histories translations of Arabic language transcripts does direct researchers to these resources and helps make these voices heard. Speaking of voices, a major recent project was the digitization and description of the sound archive of the Voice of America Radio Bureau based in Cairo. This numbers about 10,000 Arabic language news, interview, and music recordings. Metadata was applied in Arabic and English to permit findability in our digital library. These efforts were important for RBSCL because we realized that we have a global audience. Our metadata drives users to the digital library and other online resources. Besides remote users, RBSCL, as mentioned earlier, hosts visiting researchers and study groups from around the world. In serving AUC's own students and faculty, we serve people with diverse national and linguistic backgrounds and with varied experience in using special collections. The key factor in connecting our user base with the collections at RBSCL is our team. Their diverse backgrounds, linguistically, national origin, in gender, and other life experiences are essential to making accessible these holdings on Egypt and AUC heritage. Oral history interviewers need to literally and figuratively speak the language of their subjects. We rely on diverse expertise from photography to Egyptology to conservation to build and promote collections. International work study students bring their own subject knowledge as well. Multilingual personnel are vital for describing our holdings, translating them and presenting them online or in person to users. RBSCL is fortunate that, being based in Egypt and AUC, we have many talented individuals to support. For example, on the Voice of America project, we hired excellent students and recent graduates as research assistants who could engage with the material in that archive and describe it for a wide audience. To adapt AUC's early tagline, it's that kind of openness to diversity and inclusion that allows RBSCL to serve as an archival bridge of friendliness. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank the conference organizers so much for this opportunity to present to you today. So I'll be talking about Ferry and the archival silence of the California ghost town and its marginalized communities. Once a thriving town during the mid to late 1800s, Hills Ferry has disappeared from the recent memory of California history. In the seminal year of 1888, the town was dismantled, and over 20 of its structures were moved to the nearby community of Newman, about 3 miles away. Much of Hills Ferry's land was later sold as private residences. Even the descendants of ancestral graves today must now obtain permission from the current landowners to visit their deceased. Ever since I first learned of Hills Ferry, I have likened it to the fictional character Haku from Miyazaki's incredible work Spirited Away. Haku was a river spirit, but his river was filled in to build an apartment complex, so he could never truly again revisit his river. He first loses his river, and then he loses the memory of his river. Similarly, Hills Ferry was abandoned and erased due to the decisions of a few powerful and wealthy individuals, and in the name of progress. Like Haku's river, Hills Ferry can't truly be visited, and in due course, the memory of it has been largely lost. So this presentation discusses the archival silence of Hills Ferry by examining the dynamics between those of influence and power in contrast to the marginalized communities and individuals that were crucial to the town's development. The vibrant community that farmed its lands and harvested its lucrative wheat crops and provided entertainment in the saloons have often been treated with derision or completely ignored in existing histories. The Chinese community, for example, which according to population data made up almost half of the total family residences within Hills Ferry, was always separated out from European American settlers in published histories. And as a result, their many contributions have been minimized. The town's bordello workers have almost always been grouped into one sensationalized category, and its wheat threshers have been presented primarily through violent outbursts reported in the local papers of the day. At the center of these three groups is an individual that I will talk about in a little bit named Bob. And these are some images of Hills Ferry today. What we do know of Hills Ferry is found largely in published local histories, census records, and newspaper accounts, as well as textual documents and photographs located in a few identified archival collections. And those are shown here. Combined, these sources reveal an incredibly diverse and vibrant town, especially from the 1850s through the 1880s. What is also revealed is that much of the archival record is missing from Hills Ferry. While the more affluent European American settlers are fairly well represented in the source materials, other members of the community fall into a category that I argue can be described as archival silence. But what exactly are archival silences, and where and why do they exist? Archival silences may exist wherever there is any distortion or absence in the archival record, which results in gaps or misrepresentations of the past. Archival silence is sometimes used, for example, to describe records that are lost or destroyed. Correspondence representing only one side of a conversation, pretty common in archives, artwork of an unknown origin or creator, or photographs of unidentified people, as shown here. And these images are from individuals who lived in Hills Ferry. According to Dominique Lester, archival silences can be divided into three overarching categories: records that were not created, records that were created, but not preserved or collected, and records that are not properly described because of biased disclosure. Perhaps the most widely known image of a resident of Hills Ferry exists in a photograph of a Chinese woman known as Agun. Imagine that you lead a long life, surviving human trafficking, moved against your will from one continent to another, only to be remembered by a caption describing how you were won in a poker game and brought to Hills Ferry. As I began my research on Hills Ferry, this enigmatic and tragically captioned photograph kept reappearing in secondary source materials. Thus, I decided to find any primary source materials on her life. I located this original photograph shown here of Agun in the Newman Museum, the town to which over 20 structures and most of the human community of Hills Ferry moved. This framed photograph of Agun is shown here in situ at the museum. The photograph was donated by hotel operator of the Russ House, Charles Huber. This photograph of Agun has rarely been contextualized in the research, often appearing in local history publications about Chinese communities of Hills Ferry and Newman, or in secondary source monograph discussions of the numerous bordellos in the area, but without background of who she was or what happened to her after her arrival in Hills Ferry. For decades, this photograph has been accompanied by the stark caption, Agun, 1872, a Chinese woman won in a poker game in Carson City, Nevada, and brought to Hills Ferry in 1872. But how could a person in the era after the U.S. Emancipation Proclamation have been trafficked in this way? The reason can be explained by gangs and complicit individuals that operated an illegal slave trade of young women between China and the United States. The photo has been associated with this caption through the years, so that the stark text appears to define Agun. Here, the archival silence, I contend, is the bias in the description, as obviously she has not been forgotten, but the crime that was done to her has not been redressed, grossly minimizing her story in this stark caption to that of a sensationalized statistic. Agun rests at the center of this study, on archival silence in the disappeared town of Hillsbury. She was brought to the town during the height of its growth during the early 1870s, and she moved with the community to Newman in 1888, living in Newman until relative old age when she died in 1928. It is therefore irrefutable that Agun worked, lived, and coexisted with the groups presented in the study, individuals that made up a vital workforce and were embedded in this community, but lacking socioeconomic power, and as such, running a greater risk of being erased, forgotten, or as in the case of Agun, I contend, misrepresented. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about my literature review and methodological approach. Archival scholar Jeanette A. Bastien provides examples of non-traditional expressions of research, including memory, art, performance, and landscapes, as well as other forms. It is posited that alternate expressions of evidence may result in a more contextualized and illuminated archive, a situation that provides clarity when the narrative account is unavailable or incomplete. The site of the erased town, for example, the actual landscape of Hillsbury is a provocative materialistic expression, I contend, one that is crucial to understanding what has been lost. It's as if the disappearance of the town itself is a metaphor for the archival silence of its forgotten community. Literature on archival silence also stresses the importance of relationships and power structures. Author D.A. Hardy discusses the significant role of these elements when hard evidence is missing from the archive. Hardy asks what relationships and power structures are present, and what do they say about what is known, but also what is not known. This critical analysis of what is missing may ultimately reveal ways in which the archive has been silenced. Such an approach presents a promising strategy for countering those very silences. Archival educator and historian Randall Jimerson discusses the ways in which North American archives have supported affluent and socially powerful individuals through biased and narrow record-keeping practices. Drawing upon archival theory, as well as literary giants such as authors George Orwell, Ralph Ellison, and others, and referencing archivists Terry Cook and Vern Harris, Jimerson argues that archivists should not be passive record keepers. That the decisions of what is collected and how archives are described have great impact and can serve social justice objectives. Jimerson directly references the early work of historian Howard Zinn, who in 1970 stated that archivists should, quote, compile a whole new world of documentary material about the lives, desires, and needs of ordinary people. So that's a little bit about the literature review and my methodological approach. Now I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about Hillsbury history, as well as the three marginalized groups that I mentioned earlier, and I will end with Agun. In 1872, the seminal naturalist and Scotsman, John Muir, described the long stretch of valley that bordered Hillsbury as, quote, an ocean of flowers, one flower bed nearly 400 miles in length by 30 in width, unquote, describing the rich variety of wildflowers budding up against the town of Hillsbury. Within this scenic location, however, was a bustling port town, a town in which crime was not monitored, and which resided along a popular path from the Pacheco Pass to the gold mines. Criminals and gangs committed many notorious murders in the area. Joaquin Murrieta is documented as having visited the town on many occasions, and the accounts of shootings and stabbings gave Hillsbury the reputation as one of the most dangerous towns in California during the mid to latter part of the 19th century, and newspaper accounts during this time often referred to it as Hell's Fury. The illustration shown here is from the 1881 work titled History of Stanislaus County, California, with illustrations, and it's accompanied by the following excerpt. Quote, the town consists of 2 hotels, 1 restaurant, 7 saloons, 1 tin shop, 2 blacksmith shops, 1 wagon shop, 3 livery stables, 2 warehouses, 2 apothecaries, 2 justices of the peace, 1 constable, 1 clock and watchmaker shop, 1 lumber yard, 2 barber shops, 1 photograph gallery, 1 shoemaker, 2 notaries, 1 attorney at law, 1 good schoolhouse, and a Masonic. So that description provides a sense of lively commerce of the town. And the author goes on to describe the Miller and Lux Canal, providing irrigation to the area. But it was a combination of irrigation projects like this one, along with damming throughout California, that would lead to the reduction of rivers, and it would lead to the reduction of the San Joaquin River, shown here at the foreground in the illustration. Eventually, steamer travel, like the steamer shown here, became unsustainable. Added to this was the completion of the railroad lines and a train station in 1887, far from Hills Ferry, but closer to nearby Newman. And a large section of the town was donated by Newman's namesake, one of the richest men in Hills Ferry, Simon Newman. And he donated that land to the Southern Pacific Railroad. So the fateful location of the nearest railroad station is really what initiated the sudden abandonment of Hills Ferry starting in 1888, 87, and relatively with commencement relatively in 1888. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the marginalized groups I mentioned earlier who lived in Hills Ferry, starting with the Chinese enclaves. There are many gaps in the historical record regarding the Chinese enclaves living in Hills Ferry. There's evidence in census data and newspaper accounts of the important role that Chinese had as farmers, laborers, and for entertainment such as festivals and fireworks. However, there are no known first-hand accounts that I could find by Chinese settlers that were collected. Likewise, there are few references to Chinese enclaves in records created by white settlers. For example, I could find no reference throughout hundreds of letters in the Hutchins-Newsom collection to Chinese neighbors during the time the family was located in the Hills Ferry area. And this is roughly 1853 to 1888, so for a period of 35 years. This separation between Chinese and white settlers is consistent throughout the latter part of the 19th century and later through the long period of Chinese exclusion laws in California and nationally. But we do know that close to 100 Chinese living in Hills Ferry ended up moving to nearby Newman in 1888. Historian Donna Crow discusses the town of Newman's old Chinatown that developed in part due to the railroad construction in the late 1880s. The author describes a vibrant Chinese New Year celebration as well as thriving businesses such as the Jujug laundry business, and the Jujug family is shown here in the image. There were at least once 6 buildings east of the railroad tracks in Newman. And this is where the Chinese enclaves were forced to live, but which no longer exist. The buildings no longer exist. I think the next account is telling as to why. In 1912, there was a very destructive fire in this section of Newman, which caused much damage, including the destruction of Ah Goon's small home. According to the local newspaper account, Goon was incredibly distraught and had to be carried out of her cottage. Insurance companies refused to provide coverage to this area of town, or they quoted rates that were impossibly high. And to compound matters, water mains did not extend to this part of town, so that fighting a fire had to be done with chemicals. This account shows how tenuous the existence of residents like Agun and the broader Chinese community was. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the wheat laborers and Hills Ferry's social life. Individuals like Simon Newman and other well-to-do farmers and businessmen within Hills Ferry are very well documented in primary and secondary sources. But by contrast, very little is known about the laborers who worked for the landowners. The exception was anyone involved in victimization or perpetration of a crime, as this type of sensationalized content would often make the newspapers, including the individual's name and occupation, to add insult to injury, so to speak. Hills Ferry wheat industry and its port were crucial to the expansion of the wheat industry in California. With the decline of the gold rush in the 1850s, followed the second gold rush, sometimes referred to as the golden harvest of wheat that was grown throughout California and especially in the Central Valley where Hills Ferry resided. The industry would also find an international market as the Franco-Prussian War of the early 1870s impacted a desperate need for wheat in Europe. And it was during the 1870s that California began to export large amounts of wheat to England and Australia. Wheat threshing was grueling, dangerous work. The machinery of the time was unforgiving, and one misstep could result in the loss of limb or death. Laborers working in this industry were literally putting life and limb on the line. Such physically demanding work necessitated a way to relax during precious free time. Drinking was a favorite pastime in the town, and Hills Ferry even had its own brand of alcoholic beverages, locally fermented and bottled in Hills Ferry. One was called Hell's Fury Smooth Stuff, and the other one was called Sheep Herder's Delight. Sheep herding was another popular line of work in Hills Ferry and its environs, eventually becoming a dominant occupation as river levels began to decline in the 1870s due to irrigation and damming. The customers of saloons and bordellos were generally younger itinerant men that were part of the vital farm labor in Hills Ferry. The saloons and bordellos provided a sense of community, especially alcohol and conversation, to relatively young single laborers who were often working far away from home. Now I'm going to discuss some of the individuals that worked for, as a group, the individuals that worked within the bordellos. Because of how prostitution may be sensationalized or demonized in histories of the American West, there is an inherent marginalization of sex workers. Recently, however, more focus has been paid to the individuals working in this industry. Catherine Holder Spook contends that the roles, relationships, and functions of men and women's work during this period must be reevaluated in order to fully understand how these attributes have evolved through time. The lives of sex workers were known to be incredibly harsh. The average career of a sex worker in the American West during the mid to late 19th century is estimated to have been about 6 years. And many prostitutes died of disease, alcohol addiction, drug addiction, and sometimes even suicide. Though there are accounts of prostitutes who would transition to different work, later marry and or have families. Very little is known about the sex workers of Hills Ferry, even though their documented numbers made up a significant percentage of the overall population. Hills Ferry's bordellos were well known far and wide outside of the town of Hills Ferry at the time. Especially well known was an establishment called the Oasis and the Pink Lady. The Oasis even had its prominent place in the illustration that I showed earlier from 1881, and this is a detail from that illustration showing the Oasis with revelers outside on the patio. There were purportedly as many as 5 brothels in Hills Ferry, and the Oasis was documented as having between 36 and 50 prostitutes during the mid to late 19th century. Probably from around 1855 to 1887, when the town began to move to Newman. 50 individuals working at a single establishment during this time is a large number relative to the overall population of Hills Ferry, which for the city proper was 500, and the outlying areas was a 2,500 at its largest. So we can pretty much bet that it was at least 10% of the population, and to not have any records that reflect that is just tragic. Now, oftentimes prostitution was not a choice, and young women were trafficked into this line of work. Agun is documented in the Newman Museum's corresponding photograph caption as having been won in a poker game brought to Hills Ferry in 1872. Gun was likely the victim of human trafficking from China to California. Up to 6,000 Chinese women were trafficked from China to the United States between 1852 and 1873. According to Richard Stephen Street, it was rumored that Agun had poisoned her captor in 1893 and then ran a bordello in Hills Ferry and later in Newman that catered to Chinese clientele. Street's research is based on the Frank Lotta's Sky Farming collection at the Huntington Library. Though I reviewed files with Agun's name and all the files with Hills Ferry's name from the Sky Farming collection, I was unable to verify this information. It's possible that the information about Agun is in another location in this large collection, however. Local Newman historian Bill Sherman counters the claim that Agun was a bordello owner. Sherman claims that though Agun lived in Hills Ferry and later in the area of Newman in which prostitution existed, which was the same area where Chinese citizens were forced to live, that she was likely not associated with prostitution itself. Given these conflicting accounts, outside of the 1872 photograph, newspaper articles have provided the strongest account of Agun's life, but even here, her life is sparsely documented up to her death in 1928. In her obituary, she is described as a friendly individual who for several decades, or as long as anyone can remember, was a well-known figure in Hills Ferry and later Newman. There is no mention of bordellos or prostitution in her obituary. She is described as having no extended family, no children, spouse, or partner. Much of her life remains a mystery, though her photograph is one of the most widely reproduced artifacts in relation to Hills Ferry. Agun died in a pauper's grave in Modesto in 1928, and though she may have been a fond individual in the community, it's tragic to think that no one could have come forward to assist with payment of her funeral services. Her portrait is still prominently displayed in the Newman Museum, alongside the caption of having been won in a poker game. In conclusion, the archives of marginalized individuals are often silent. Their records were either never created, never collected and preserved, or are misrepresented in what remains of the archival record. However, the stories of these communities illuminate the vibrancy of lost history, and in this study, a lost town. Furthermore, by discussing existing histories of archival silence combined with known historical evidence of Hills Ferry, the circumstances through which marginalized communities of this town lived are better understood, recognized, and remembered. It's as though the town that disappeared because of redirected water and the birth of the railroad set forth ghosts that linger on the periphery, ghosts that long to tell their stories in order to redress the past. What can Ogun's enigmatic and tragically captioned photograph from the 1870s tell us about the past, about the subject's life, and the communities in which she resided? I believe that this photograph whispers to us that there are bridges that have yet to be built between available historical evidence and poetic justice. Thank you so much for your